There are things that can topple a government, a war, a revolution, or in the case of 19th century London, a very, very bad smell. Tonight we explore two of the city's strangest disasters, one that you could smell and one that you could drink. Before we begin our descent, a quiet thought. It is a strange and wonderful thing that these stories, whispered from one corner of the world, find you in another. If you wish, leave a comment below with the city and the time of night or day where you are listening. It is a lovely thought that as one person drifts to sleep in London moonlight, another listens in the California sun. And if these whispers offer you a moment of peace, a quiet like is always a welcome signal from across the distance. Subscribing ensures you will not miss the stories yet to be told. But these are not stories of loud shocks or sudden scares. Like all stories here, they will be told softly, strange pieces of history, whispered for a quiet night. So now, find that comfortable position. Dim the lights. Let the noise of your world fade away, and let the strange sounds of London's past guide you to sleep. Imagine a smell. Not the familiar smell of rain on dry earth or wood smoke from a distant chimney. Imagine a smell so powerful, so pervasive, that it could bend the laws of a nation. A smell so potent it could send the world's most powerful politicians fleeing from their own halls of government. This was not the smell of war or of some ancient curse. This, in the summer of 1858, was the smell of London. And it was, in the most ironic way possible, the smell of progress. To understand it, you must first picture the city. This is not just any city, this is the capital of the world. London, in the mid-19th century, is the heart of a vast and mighty empire upon which the sun never sets. It is a city of staggering wealth and crushing poverty, living side by side. It is a place of ceaseless invention, of steam and iron, of new bridges spanning the river and new buildings reaching for the sky. The air hums with the energy of millions. The streets are a chaotic symphony of horse-drawn carriages, of vendors shouting their wares, of the construction of a new world. It is a city convinced of its own genius, its own destiny, its own unquestionable superiority. But beneath this grand facade of power and progress, a secret was festering, a dark, dirty, and deeply unpleasant secret that every Londoner knew intimately, but no one knew how to solve. The secret was the city's lifeblood, its ancient highway, its most celebrated feature, the River Thames. For centuries, the Thames had been the city's heart, carrying its ships, feeding its people, and inspiring its poets. But by the 1850s, it had been given a new, unofficial job. It had become the city's toilet. And here lies the great paradox, the central, absurd joke of the story. The problem was made infinitely worse by one of the era's proudest achievements in domestic engineering, the flush toilet. Before its widespread adoption, waste was collected from homes in cesspools, a smelly but contained system. But the Victorians, with their obsession for cleanliness and sanitation within their own four walls, embraced the water closet as a miracle of modern living. With the pull of a chain, all unpleasantness could be instantly washed away. It was clean, it was private, it was civilized. There was just one fatal flaw in this grand design, the question of where it was all being washed away to. London's ancient network of sewers was never built to handle this. They were designed for rainwater. Now, thanks to the miracle of the flush toilet, the waste of 2.5 million people was being channeled directly from their homes into these old brick sewers which had one primary destination, the River Thames. Every day, hundreds of tons of raw sewage, a toxic soup of human waste, street refuse, and industrial chemicals poured into the heart of the city. The river, once a thriving ecosystem, was dying, It had become a grey, greasy, bubbling stew of filth. It was a biological dead zone where fish could no longer survive. In some places, the deposits of sewage on the riverbed were 6 feet deep. People still drew their drinking water from this river, often from points just downstream from a major sewer outflow. Cholera, a disease we now know is waterborne, swept through the city in devastating epidemics, killing tens of thousands. Yet the great minds of the age, for all their engineering marvels, had created a perfect, city-sized system for delivering disease to their own doorsteps. For most of the year, this horrifying situation was a known but grimly accepted fact of life. Londoners had grown accustomed to the river's unpleasantness. The problem was bad, but it was, for the most part, manageable. The city continued its proud march of progress, building its empire, confident in its own greatness. But all of that was about to change. The city was on the cusp of a fateful summer, a summer so hot and so dry that it would take London's dirty little secret and turn it into an inescapable, city-wide catastrophe. A monster that would rise from the river and be given a name of its own. The monster that was to rise from the River Thames did not need the darkness of night. It needed heat. It needed stillness. It needed the perfect, suffocating conditions that could only be provided by an act of nature. It needed the summer of 1858. That summer did not arrive gently. It descended upon London like a fever, a brassy, relentless heat that settled over the city in June and refused to leave. The sky, day after day, was a pale, hazy, unforgiving blue. There was no rain, there was no breeze. There was only the sun beating down on the cobblestones and brickwork, turning the world's greatest city into a sprawling oven. You can imagine the feeling in the air. It was thick, heavy, and hard to breathe, a mixture of coal smoke, dust, and the oppressive humidity rising from the ground. The usual frantic energy of London seemed to slow to a crawl. Horses plodded wearily, their heads low. People sought refuge in the slivers of shade cast by the tall buildings, fanning themselves with newspapers and hats. The tar used to seal the wooden blocks of the streets began to soften and melt, trapping the heels of unwary pedestrians. It was a city under siege, not by an army, but by the sun itself. And all the while, the heat was performing a terrible alchemy upon the city's great river. The Thames, the mother of London, was in agony. The lack of rain meant that no fresh water was flowing in from its tributaries to flush it clean. The river's flow slowed to a thick, sluggish crawl. It was no longer a river in motion, but a long, stagnant pond. And into this pond the city continued to pour its waste, a relentless torrent of filth from the 2.5 million souls who lived along its banks. The raw sewage, with nowhere to go, simply sat there, collecting, concentrating, and stewing under the relentless glare of the sun. The great river began to cook. Under the intense heat, the tons of organic matter suspended in the water began to ferment at an accelerated rate. You could see it happening. Bubbles of methane and hydrogen sulfide would rise from the depths and pop on the surface, releasing noxious puffs of gas into the already stifling air. The water itself, once merely murky, had transformed into an opaque, brown-green soup, so thick in places that it looked as though you could walk upon it. It was no longer water in any recognizable sense. It had become a primordial entity, a living, breathing, and deeply unwell creature lying at the heart of the city. As the weeks of drought wore on, the water level of the Thames dropped lower and lower, and as it receded, it revealed a final grotesque horror. The riverbanks, which were normally covered by the tide, were now exposed. They were not made of sand or stone, but of a thick, black, glistening mud, 6 feet deep in places. This was the physical accumulation of centuries of filth, a putrid archive of London's history. The sight was appalling. The newly exposed mudbanks would bake in the sun all day, creating a crust on the surface, while the foulness beneath continued to bubble and ferment. The stage was now perfectly set. You had a stagnant, super-concentrated sewer that had been heated to the point of active decomposition. You had the sun baking the newly exposed banks of toxic mud. The mother of all rivers had become the father of all problems. It was no longer just a silent, hidden shame flowing through the city. The river was now a laboratory on the verge of releasing an airborne experiment upon the population. The monster was ready to rise from the water, to leave the riverbed, and take on a new, invisible form that would invade every home, every office, every sacred hall, and bring the world's greatest city to its knees. The laboratory of the river had finished its work. The weeks of heat and stagnation had created a perfect storm of decomposition. Now the experiment was about to be released. The monster was ready to leave the water and take to the air. It did not arrive like a thunderclap. It arrived as a whisper of a threat, a creeping horror that began along the riverbanks and slowly, insidiously, began its conquest of the city. At first, it was just the dockworkers and the fishermen who noticed it, a familiar foulness that had somehow gained a new, aggressive power. Then it began to drift, carried on the still heavy air, moving inland block by block. To call it a smell is to do it a great injustice. A smell is merely a suggestion, a fleeting note in the air. This was a physical presence, a thick, tangible miasma that you could feel on your skin and at the back of your throat. Those who experienced it struggled to find the words. They said it was like the ghost of every rotten cabbage in history, mixed with the sour breath of a tannery and the faint, sweetish odor of decay. It was the collective sigh of 1,000,000 dying creatures, a sulphurous fog that seemed to claw at the nostrils. One politician, trying to describe it, said it was a smell that one could not just smell, but see and taste. It was a presence so thick it felt like you had to shoulder your way through it. It was also a great and terrible equalizer. The stink, as it was now universally known, did not respect wealth or status. It seeped under the grand doors of Belgravia mansions with the same ease as it entered the hovels of the poor. It found its way through the keyholes of royal palaces and into the most heavily draped drawing rooms of high society. Ladies fainted in their parlours, their delicate sensibilities overwhelmed. Gentlemen held scented handkerchiefs to their faces, a futile gesture against an enemy that could not be stopped. The sales of perfume, of smelling salts, of chloride of lime to hang in doorways skyrocketed. People smoked tobacco constantly, not for pleasure, but in a desperate attempt to replace one foul odour with another. The city's daily life began to revolve around this invisible tyrant. Those who could afford to simply fled London, escaping to their country estates. Those who remained tried to live in a state of siege. Windows were nailed shut despite the suffocating heat. People tried to seal the cracks in their doors with rags. They burned lavender and incense, which did nothing but add a floral note to the overwhelming stench of decay. The riverboats, once a popular form of transport, were now completely empty, as no one could bear to be near the source of the affliction. The Thames, the city's pride, was now its greatest shame, an entity to be avoided at all costs. You could taste it. This was perhaps the most unsettling part. It was a flavour that coated the tongue, a coppery, foul taste that seemed to linger for hours after you had moved indoors. It was as if the river itself had become airborne, its polluted water turning into a vapour that every citizen was now forced to inhale with every breath. The very air of the world's greatest city had become a diluted form of poison. The monster was no longer confined to the river. It owned the air itself. It had conquered the homes, the streets, and the lungs of rich and poor alike. Now it was turning its attention to the one place that thought itself immune, the seat of power itself. The stink was going into politics. The Houses of Parliament, a grand Gothic masterpiece of towers and spires rising from the north bank of the Thames, was the symbol of Great Britain's power and permanence. It was the nerve centre of an empire, a place where confident men in fine suits decided the fate of nations. It was a fortress of tradition and law. And in July of 1858 it was a fortress under siege from an enemy it could not see and did not know how to fight. The great stink had arrived at the doors of government, and it was not in a respectful mood. It ignored the stern-faced guards, drifted past the ancient statues, and crept into the hallowed halls of power with an insolent ease. The reaction was one of immediate and aristocratic panic. The most powerful men in the world were rendered utterly helpless. Their first line of defense was to soak the heavy velvet curtains of the building in chloride of lime, a bleaching agent. The idea was to create a chemical barrier to neutralize the foul air. The result, however, was that the already unbearable smell of the river was now mixed with the choking chemical stench of chlorine, creating a new, uniquely awful perfume. One member of Parliament, writing to the Times, declared that he was forced to rush from the library with a nausea that he could not describe. The very business of running an empire ground to a halt. Important legal cases in the courthouse rooms had to be abandoned as lawyers, jurors, and judges fled the unbearable atmosphere. In the committee rooms of the House of Commons, where the great issues of the day were meant to be debated, the primary issue became survival. Members were seen clutching handkerchiefs to their faces, their eyes watering, unable to concentrate on anything but the ever-present stench. The great engine of British government was being suffocated. The situation became so absurd, so completely untenable, that the politicians began to seriously consider the unthinkable, abandoning London. There were formal proposals to move the entire government and the royal court to another city, perhaps Oxford or St. Albans, until the crisis passed. You can just imagine the sheer comical humiliation of it. This was the government that ruled a quarter of the world's population, a power that had faced down Napoleon, brought to its knees and forced into exile by nothing more than a bad smell. It was the ultimate, final proof that the problem could no longer be ignored. The crisis forced a decision with astonishing speed. For years, plans to build a new sewer system had been endlessly debated, delayed by arguments over cost and responsibility. Now there was no more time for debate. A new bill was rushed into Parliament. The debate on the bill, which would normally have taken weeks, was famously short. The urgency of the smell was a more powerful argument than any orator could make. The bill passed through all its necessary stages in a record time of just 18 days. The government had finally committed the money, an astronomical sum for the time, to fix the problem for good. The politicians, spurred to action not by scientific evidence or compassion for the thousands who had died of cholera, but by the simple, undeniable discomfort of their own noses, had finally done their part. They had passed a law, a piece of paper authorizing a solution. But a law cannot build a tunnel, and a piece of paper cannot tame a river. Now the city needed a man with the genius, the vision, and the sheer grit to turn that law into thousands of miles of brick and iron. They needed a hero to go into the underworld and slay the monster for good. The politicians in Parliament had finally been spurred to action. But their motivation was not based on compassion, nor on the elegant scientific papers of a few forward-thinking doctors. They were motivated by fear, and their fear was not of the contaminated water they were drinking, but of the very air they were breathing. They were afraid of an invisible enemy, a phantom killer that the Victorians had a very specific name for: miasma. The miasma theory was the great medical superstition of the 19th century. It was the belief that diseases like cholera, chlamydia, and the Black Death were caused not by microorganisms, but by a bad air, a noxious cloud of poisonous vapour that rose from decaying organic matter. To the Victorians, it seemed perfectly logical. The poorest, most crowded parts of the city were also the smelliest, and they were invariably where disease was most rampant. It was easy to connect the foul odours of the slums with the high death rates and conclude that the smell itself was the killer. The stench rising from the Thames was, in their minds, the ultimate miasma, a gaseous angel of death. The true killer, of course, was far smaller and far more insidious. Cholera, the disease they feared most, was not carried in the air, but in the water. It was a terrifying illness. A person could be perfectly healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall, their body racked by a swift and brutal dehydration. London had suffered horrific cholera epidemics in the years prior to the Great Stink, waves of death that had carried off tens of thousands of citizens, and the source of this death was the very river they were now so repulsed by, not because of its smell, but because it was a perfect delivery system for the cholera bacterium. In this age of flawed science, one man had seen the truth. His name was Dr. John Snow, and he was a quiet pioneer of epidemiology. During a severe cholera outbreak in 1854, just 4 years before the Great Stink, Snow conducted a piece of brilliant medical detective work. In the Soho district, he meticulously mapped every single death, going from house to house. He noticed that the deaths were all clustered around one particular public water pump on Broad Street. He presented his findings to the local authorities and convinced them to take the handle off the pump. Almost immediately, the outbreak in that area stopped. He had proven that the disease was in the water, but his groundbreaking work and the germ theory it supported was largely ignored, even ridiculed, by the scientific establishment. The idea of invisible creatures in the water causing disease sounded like something from a fairy tale. The powerful, intuitive, and deeply wrong miasma theory held sway. And so we arrive at the great central irony of this entire story. The Great Stink of 1858 terrified the government into action because they believed the foul air, the miasma, would trigger the next great cholera epidemic. Their fear was based on the wrong science. Yet, this scientifically flawed terror was the only thing powerful enough to make them finally approve and fund the one solution that would solve the actual problem. They did not set out to clean the water to stop the spread of germs. They set out to get rid of the bad smell to stop the spread of miasma. In one of history's most fortunate accidents, the right solution was chosen for entirely the wrong reason. The city, driven by a phantom, was now committed to a monumental course of action. The law was passed, the money was ready. But it would take a man of singular genius to turn that law into a physical reality. A problem of this magnitude, the cleansing of a city of millions, could not be solved by politicians or theorists. It required a different kind of mind. It required a man who thought not in words, but in gradients and pressures, not in theories, but in tunnels and tides. London needed an engineer. And in its hour of need, it found the perfect man for the job. His name was Joseph Bazalgette. He was not a flamboyant public figure. He was a quiet, methodical, and supremely determined man, the chief engineer for London's Metropolitan Board of Works. He had been working on plans for a new sewer system for years, only to be frustrated by political indecision. Now his moment had finally come. The plan he presented was not a simple repair. It was a revolutionary reimagining of the city's relationship with its waste. It was audacious in its simplicity and breathtaking in its scale. He proposed building a completely new parallel sewer system. A network of enormous interceptor sewers would be constructed deep underground, running from west to east, following the natural slope of the river valley. These massive tunnels would act like a safety net, catching all the sewage from the existing local sewers before it could ever reach the Thames. This captured waste would then be carried far to the east of London, down to the estuary, where it would be held in reservoirs and released into the sea on the outgoing tide. To appreciate the scale of Bazalgette's vision, you have to consider the numbers. His plan called for 82 miles of massive main interceptor sewers, brick-lined tunnels so large you could drive a horse-drawn carriage through them. These main arteries would then be fed by over 1,100 miles of new street sewers, connecting every house in London to the new system. The project would require 318 million bricks, nearly 1 million cubic yards of concrete, and an army of workers digging deep into the London clay. It was, at the time, the single largest and most ambitious civil engineering project the world had ever seen. And within this grand plan lay a stroke of quiet, unassuming genius. When it came time to calculate the necessary diameter for the main pipes, Bazalgette took the figures for London's current population, determined the size needed, and then, on his own authority, said to his draftsman, "Well, we're only going to do this once, and there's always the unforeseen. We'll just double it." This one, simple decision, single-handedly future-proofed London's sewer system for the next 100 years. He anticipated the city's explosive growth in a way no one else had, saving future generations from having to repeat the entire process. But Bazalgette's vision wasn't just about what lay beneath the ground. He used the immense project to reshape the very face of London itself. He built the great embankments that line the Thames today, the Victoria, Chelsea, and Albert embankments. These grand riverside promenades were not just for decoration. They were a clever way to house the main sewer lines, while also reclaiming acres of land from the foul-smelling mudflats and creating new roads that eased the city's notorious traffic. He was not just hiding the city's waste, he was creating a new, beautiful public space on top of it. The blueprints were drawn. The city, still holding its breath against the lingering smell, gave its approval. The quiet engineer was about to begin his war, a war waged not with cannons and soldiers, but with an army of labourers with shovels and bricks deep in the underworld of the city. He was ready to tame the monster for good. The blueprints were drawn, the money was approved, the quiet engineer was ready. Now came the monumental task of turning his vision into a reality. For the next decade, London became a city at war with itself. It was a war waged not on a distant battlefield, but deep in the dark, wet clay beneath its own streets. The soldiers in this war were not men in uniform, but a special breed of labourer known as the navvies. They were an army of thousands, strong, hard-drinking and fearless men who took on the most dangerous construction work the era had to offer, all for a few shillings a day. The work was perilous in the extreme. You can imagine these men descending into the dark, their way lit only by the flickering, unsteady light of safety lamps. They were digging through a city that was already a maze of pipes, foundations, and forgotten history. At any moment, they could strike a gas main, causing a catastrophic explosion. They could hit a water pipe, flooding their tunnel in seconds. And they constantly faced the risk of cave-ins, of being buried alive in the suffocating darkness. They dug through the remains of ancient Roman villas, through the gruesome soil of medieval plague pits, through a subterranean world that held all of London's secrets. The danger wasn't just from collapse. The very ground they were digging through was saturated with a century of filth. The soil itself released noxious and explosive gases, primarily methane. The navvies became grimly familiar with the blue haze of the gas, and they knew that a single spark from a pickaxe striking a stone could ignite the air around them. This was not just construction, it was a hazardous descent into a man-made underworld, a place of constant threat and suffocating gloom. For the citizens on the surface, the war was an unavoidable part of daily life. The sounds of London were now punctuated by the rhythmic clang of hammers on iron, the hiss of steam engines powering cranes, and the dull thud of controlled explosions deep underground. Entire streets were ripped open, their cobblestones piled high, revealing the complex guts of the city below. It was a decade of noise, dirt, and disruption, the necessary chaos of a city performing life-saving surgery upon itself. This was a project on a scale so grand that it required constant innovation. Bazalgette and his team had to invent new techniques as they went. One of their most important breakthroughs was in the very material they were using. They needed a brick and a mortar that could withstand the constant damp and the corrosive chemicals of the sewage. They perfected the use of a new material, Portland cement, creating a mortar that was far stronger and more durable than anything used before. It was a quiet, unglamorous innovation, but it was essential to ensuring the tunnels would last for centuries. And as the tunnels snaked their way beneath the city, great structures began to rise above ground. The pumping stations like Crossness and Abbey Mills were the hearts of the new system, designed to lift the sewage up from the deep tunnels to the outflow reservoirs. But these were not mere functional industrial buildings. In true Victorian fashion, they were built to be magnificent. They were the cathedrals of sewage. Bazalgette designed them with ornate ironwork, soaring arches, and intricate brick patterns. They were grand public monuments, a testament to the immense civic pride the Victorians took in their engineering. They were celebrating not a victory in war, but a victory over filth. The work was nearly done. The city and the river held their breath. In 1865, after nearly a decade of ceaseless, dangerous work, the main parts of the great interceptor sewer system were complete. The moment came to open the valves, to divert the flow of London's waste away from the river and into the new, deep tunnels. For the first time in centuries, the raw sewage of the city was no longer being poured directly into the Thames. A profound change had occurred in the underworld, and now the world on the surface waited to see the result. The effect was not instantaneous, but it was miraculous. Slowly but surely, the mother of all rivers began to heal. With the daily torrent of filth cut off, the natural ebb and flow of the tides began to do their work, scrubbing the riverbed clean and carrying the remaining pollution out to sea. The foul, omnipresent smell that had defined the great stink of 1858 was gone. The water, once an opaque brown-green soup, began to clear. And then, a sign of life that no one had seen for decades, fish began to return to the central Thames. Londoners, who had been forced to turn their backs on their river, could now enjoy it once more. But the greatest victory was an invisible one. With the source of the contamination removed from their drinking water, London's great cholera epidemics came to an end. The disease that had killed tens of thousands, that had terrified the population for generations, was finally defeated. Joseph Bazalgette, in his quiet, methodical way, had saved more lives than any doctor of his era. He had achieved it not by curing the disease, but by removing its cause. It was one of the greatest public health triumphs in human history. Today, the 1,100 miles of tunnels and sewers that Bazalgette's army built are still there. They are the invisible monument to this incredible achievement, a masterpiece of engineering hidden just a few feet beneath the streets. Millions of Londoners live and work above this system every day, their lives protected by it, without ever seeing it or knowing the story of its creation. It is a silent, functioning legacy of Victorian foresight, a testament to the power of long-term thinking and bold public investment. Sir Joseph Bazalgette, as he became known, was knighted for his work, but he remains a relatively unsung hero, a man whose work was too essential to be glamorous. The Great Stink was a story of a disaster that arrived slowly, a creeping horror born from years of neglect and flawed ideas, finally solved by reason, genius, and a decade of hard labor. It was a predictable crisis, met with a monumental solution. But not all of London's strange disasters were so slow to arrive. Sometimes disaster didn't creep in as a foul gas from a river. Sometimes it came as a sudden, violent, and entirely unexpected wave. Our next story takes us back a few decades earlier to the year 1814 to a poor, crowded London neighbourhood, where the greatest threat wasn't what was flowing under the streets, but what was brewing inside a giant wooden tank. It is the story of a disaster born not from filth, but from one of London's greatest loves, the strange, tragic, and almost unbelievable tale of the London beer flood. London has always been a city defined by its river, and therefore by its floods. For centuries, Londoners have known the grim reality of the Thames bursting its banks, of a cold, grey, muddy water creeping into streets and cellars, bringing with it damp, disease, and disruption. These floods were a known enemy, a predictable hardship of city life. But in the autumn of 1814, a different kind of flood would visit the city. This flood did not come from the river. Its waters were not grey and cold, but dark, thick, and warm, and it arrived with a sweet, malty smell that you could sense from streets away. This was the one and only time in its long history that London was drowned not in water, but in beer. To understand this disaster, you must first picture the place where it happened. We are in the parish of St. Giles, a neighbourhood tucked away behind the grand streets of London. This is not the London of elegant townhouses and green parks. St. Giles is a rookery, one of the city's most notorious slums. It is a chaotic maze of narrow, unlit alleys, of leaning, dilapidated tenement buildings packed so tightly together that they seem to block out the sky. The air here is thick with the smell of coal smoke, gin, and unwashed humanity. It is a place of desperate poverty, home to thousands of poor Irish immigrants who have come to London seeking a better life, only to find themselves crowded into cheap, damp cellars, often with multiple families sharing a single room. These are people living on the very margins of a great and wealthy city. They are the labourers, the street vendors, the unseen masses who fuel London's rise. Their lives are hard, and their world is small and dangerous, and looming over this world a symbol of the industrial might that both employed and ignored them, stood the Meu and Company brewery. Its vast brick walls rose up over the crowded tenements like a fortress, a giant, steaming, clanking engine of commerce planted in the middle of a sea of human poverty. The brewery was a constant presence in the lives of the people of St. Giles. Unlike the disaster of 1858, the smell from this brewery was not always an unpleasant one. For the residents, the air was perpetually filled with the sweet, yeasty, slightly burnt scent of brewing malt and hops. It was simply the atmosphere of the neighbourhood, a constant reminder of the great industry next door. The brewery was famous for one product in particular, porter. This was not a light, delicate beer. Porter was a dark, thick, heavy brew, rich in calories and relatively cheap. It was the drink of the working class, the liquid fuel of the Industrial Revolution. For the labourers of London, a pint of porter was often both their drink and their meal, a brief moment of warmth and oblivion in a hard life. And so the stage is set with a terrible irony. In the heart of London, a neighbourhood of immense poverty exists in the shadow of a brewery of immense wealth. The people in this neighbourhood sustain themselves with the very drink that the brewery produces in unimaginable quantities. The product that gives them a moment of comfort is being created just next door on a scale so vast, so dangerously large, that it defies belief. And inside the high brick walls of that brewery, a giant was sleeping. A creature of wood and iron, larger than any building in the surrounding slum, filled to the brim with a dark and potent sea. Let us step inside the high brick walls of the Moo Brewery. The air here is warm and damp, thick with the smell of yeast and boiling grain. In the centre of the main brewhouse stands the source of the coming disaster and the pride of the company. It is a fermentation vat of colossal proportions. It is a true giant. It stands 22 feet tall, as high as a 3-story building, its vast bulk dominating the space around it. It is not made of metal, but of massive staves of wood, each one a plank the size of a small tree, bound together by a series of enormous iron hoops, like the rings on a giant's barrel. The scale of this thing is difficult to comprehend. This single wooden tank was built to hold over 135,000 imperial gallons of beer. That is more than 1 million pints. It was enough porter to give every single man, woman and child living in the surrounding slum of St. Giles a pint every day for more than 2 years. The sheer weight of the liquid inside was over 600 tons. It was not just a container. It was an architectural structure in its own right, a wooden cathedral built for the worship of beer. And it was not a quiet, inanimate object. It was, in its own way, alive. You can imagine standing beside it, feeling the slight vibration of the fermenting liquid within. You could hear the faint, constant groaning of the wooden staves straining under the immense pressure. You could hear the soft, steady bubbling of the yeast as it worked its magic, consuming sugar and releasing alcohol and carbon dioxide, the very process that was building the incredible pressure inside. It was a sleeping giant, its belly full and churning, its wooden muscles tense with a barely contained power. In the competitive world of early 19th century London brewing, size was everything. Having the biggest vats was a status symbol, a declaration of success and industrial might. The great vats of the London breweries were famous. They were even considered tourist attractions. Visitors would come to marvel at these wooden behemoths, these titans of industry that produced the city's favourite drink. The giant at the Moo Brewery was one of the largest and most famous of them all, a testament to the company's ambition and prosperity. Inside this celebrated vessel, the beer itself was a dark, potent sea. It was a porter, aging and maturing, developing its rich flavour. A thick, creamy brown head of foam would have sat on top of the dark liquid, a living, breathing cap on the fermenting brew. Below, the immense pressure was constant, pushing outwards against every plank, every joint, every single iron hoop. The brewery was a proud and impressive place, but it was also, in hindsight, an incredibly dangerous one. The giant did not stand alone. It was surrounded by other, smaller vats, each holding thousands of gallons more of the dark liquid. It was the king of a whole family of large, precarious containers. If the king were to fall, it would not fall alone. It would set off a chain reaction, a domino effect of destruction. On the 13th of October 1814, the great vat was full to the brim with a fresh batch of porter that had been fermenting for 10 months. The yeast was active, the pressure was building, the giant was under more stress than ever before, and deep within the iron of one of its mighty rings, a weakness was growing, a tiny, imperceptible flaw, waiting for the right moment to give way. The giant was straining. Deep within the vast, dark brewery, the immense wooden vat, holding a sea of porter, was under more pressure than ever before. The fermenting brew was alive, constantly creating a powerful, outward force against the wooden staves and the great iron hoops that held them together. For years, the giant had held its contents in check, a testament to the strength of its construction. But nothing, not even iron, can withstand such immense, relentless pressure forever. A weakness, born in the forging of the metal or developed over years of strain, was reaching its breaking point. The afternoon of October 17th, 1814 was, by all accounts, a perfectly ordinary one at the Moo Brewery. The air was filled with the usual sweet, malty aroma of the trade. The sounds were the familiar ones, the rumble of barrels, the hiss of steam, the shouting of workers. It was a factory like any other, a place of routine and labour where the extraordinary had become mundane. No one suspected that they were living out the final quiet hours before a catastrophe. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, a warehouseman named George Crick was making his rounds. His job was simple: to monitor the vats, to check the levels, to ensure that all was as it should be. As he passed the great porter vat, something caught his eye. It was not a leak, it was not a loud noise, it was something subtle, something another man might have missed. He looked up at the colossal structure and noticed that one of the enormous iron hoops, a band of metal weighing some 700 pounds, was not in its proper place. It had slipped down about 3 inches from where it was meant to be, a sign that the wood beneath it had shifted or compressed. George Crick was an experienced man. He understood the forces contained within these vats. He knew that the hoops were the only thing preventing a wooden wall from surrendering to the 600 tons of liquid pushing against it. A flicker of professional concern, a sense of things not being quite right, must have gone through his mind. He did what any diligent employee would do. He sought out his superior, the brewery storehouse clerk, and reported what he had seen. And here, in this small, quiet, and perfectly human interaction, the tragedy was sealed. The storehouse clerk, a man named Mr. Park, was not alarmed. He was, in fact, entirely unconcerned. He had seen hoops slip before. These vats groaned and shifted all the time. It was simply the nature of working with such large wooden structures. He reassured Crick that there was no cause for alarm. The pressure of the beer itself, he reasoned, would hold the hoop in place until it could be repaired in a day or two. He simply instructed Crick to write a note to one of the brewery partners, Mr. Mute, so that the matter would not be forgotten. It is a moment of almost painful, dramatic irony. You, the silent witness from the future, know the terrible significance of that slipped iron ring. You want to shout a warning, to tell them to evacuate the brewery, to alert the neighbourhood. But history is a story that has already been written. And so, George Crick, having done his duty and been told not to worry, did exactly as he was instructed. He dutifully wrote the note. A calm, bureaucratic memo about a catastrophic failure waiting to happen. The warning was given, and the warning was dismissed. The brewery workers began to finish their shifts, preparing to head home, unaware that the sleeping giant beside them was no longer just straining, it was actively, silently failing. And in less than an hour, the entire neighbourhood would pay the price. An hour passed. The sun was low in the autumn sky. The brewery was growing quiet as the day's work came to an end. Then, at approximately 5:30 in the evening, came the sound. It was not a crack or a groan, but a sudden, deafening explosion, a thunderclap so immense that it was heard for miles around. People in their homes thought it was an earthquake. Watchers on the street feared it was a terrorist attack with gunpowder, a part of the ongoing Napoleonic Wars. But for the few workers still inside the brewery, it was something far more immediate and terrifying. The giant had awakened. In the space of a heartbeat, the weakened 700-pound iron hoop had not just slipped further, it had snapped. The sudden, catastrophic release of tension caused the entire structure of the great vat to fail. The wooden staves shattered outwards with the force of a cannon blast, and 600 tons of porter, 135,000 gallons of dark, warm, fermenting liquid, were released in a single, explosive instant. The initial blast was so powerful that it blew a hole in the brewery's massive 2.5 brick-thick back wall as if it were made of paper. But the destruction was just beginning. This was not just one vat failing, it was a domino effect of industrial might. The tidal wave of beer, now free from its wooden prison, crashed with immense force into the other, smaller vats in the brewery. Several more were smashed to pieces, including another huge cask of porter, adding their contents to the growing flood. The initial deluge was now amplified, a combined tsunami of over 320,000 imperial gallons of beer. A wave was born, you must picture it. This was not a wave of clear, clean water. This was a 15-foot-high wall of dark brown, almost black liquid. It was thick and viscous, and it carried with it a great creamy head of foam. It was a warm wave, the temperature of the fermentation process, and it was not just liquid, it was a churning torrent of debris. It carried with it the splintered remains of the great vats, huge heavy planks of wood, and the snapped, twisted iron hoops, turning it from a simple flood into a destructive, grinding tsunami. This unstoppable force, now free of the building, roared out into the neighborhood. It crashed into the back of the tenement buildings that shared a wall with the brewery, the homes of the poor and unsuspecting residents of St. Giles. The flimsy brickwork, already old and crumbling, stood no chance. The wave smashed through walls, flooding cellars and ground floors in an instant, collapsing entire buildings under its immense weight and force. The deluge was free, and it was now roaring into the narrow streets and crowded cellars of St. Giles, a dark, warm and deadly tide, about to find its first victims. For the people of St. Giles, the first warning was not a sight but a sound, a deep, explosive roar that shook the very foundations of their crumbling tenement homes. It was a sound so alien and so powerful that it defied immediate explanation. But they had little time to wonder. For those living in the cellars and ground floors of the houses on New Street, directly behind the brewery, the sound was followed almost instantly by the catastrophic failure of reality itself. Walls that had stood for a century bowed inwards and then disintegrated, and the monster was upon them. You must understand this was not a flood of water. Water is something a person can, perhaps, survive. It is something one can swim in. This was a thick, viscous, semi-solid wave of warm, fermenting liquid. It moved not like a river, but like lava, a heavy, suffocating mass that filled a room in seconds. It did not just drown its victims, it crushed them. The force of the deluge, carrying with it the heavy, splintered timbers of the great vats, was enough to level entire buildings. It was a battering ram made of beer. Let us be a silent witness to the tragedy in one of the houses. In a small, humble room, a mother named Mary Banfield is having tea with her 4-year-old daughter, Hannah. It is a moment of quiet, domestic peace in a world of hardship. The simple act of sharing a cup of tea, a brief respite from the noise and grime of the rookery. They hear the great explosion, a sound that rattles their teacups. They perhaps look at each other with a flicker of alarm. But there is no time for anything more. The wall of their home dissolves into a torrent of dark, foaming liquid. The wave fills the room instantly, extinguishing the light, overturning the table, and sweeping the mother and her young child into the violent, churning chaos. In the cellar of an adjacent house, a different kind of quiet moment is taking place. A poor Irish family is holding a wake. They are gathered to mourn the death of a 2-year-old boy who had passed away the previous day. The small casket is in the room, surrounded by his grieving family and neighbors who have come to pay their respects. They are sharing stories, perhaps a drink, their sorrow contained within the close, damp walls of the cellar. The explosion from the brewery would have sounded like the wrath of God descending upon them. And then the flood came, not as a trickle, but as a deluge, bursting through the foundations, filling the underground room in a matter of moments. The mourners, trapped below ground with no means of escape, were drowned in the dark, warm torrent, their own wake becoming a tomb. The wave, having spent its initial violent force, now became a river. It poured down the surrounding streets, filling the narrow alleys, turning the entire neighborhood into a dark, sticky, frothing lake. It was waist-deep in the main thoroughfares. The air was thick with the overpowering sweet smell of porter and the terrified screams of those trapped in the wreckage. People scrambled onto furniture to escape the rising tide. Others, caught in the open, were swept off their feet by the current. The rookery, already a place of misery, had, in the space of 5 minutes, been transformed into a scene of unimaginable and utterly bizarre devastation. Survivors, covered in the dark, sticky liquid, emerged from the ruins, their eyes wide with the shock of having survived a disaster they could not yet comprehend. As the dark tide of beer slowly began to recede, the true human cost of the disaster was revealed. The initial chaos gave way to a grim search for survivors and for the dead. In the end, 8 people lost their lives, not to an earthquake or a fire, but to a flood of porter. Most of them were women and children, the ones most likely to be at home in the middle of the afternoon. There was young Hannah Banfield, the 4-year-old girl who had been having tea with her mother. There was Eleanor Cooper, a 14-year-old servant girl who had been washing pots in the cellar of the Tavistock Arms pub when the walls gave way. There were the mourners at the wake, a mother and her son among them. These were not statistics. They were the residents of St. Giles, the poorest of the poor, whose lives were extinguished by an industrial accident they had no part in creating. But what happened next is perhaps the strangest part of this already bizarre story, a moment that perfectly captures the desperation and dark humour of 19th century London. As the news of the disaster spread, people did not just rush to the scene to help, many rushed there to drink. The streets and cellars were still flooded with thousands of gallons of free beer, and for the impoverished residents of the area, this was seen as a miraculous, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. A great, festive and ghoulish party began amidst the wreckage. You can imagine the scene. Men, women, and even children ran from their homes with every container they could find, buckets, pots, pans and teacups, scooping the dark liquid directly from the filthy streets. They drank deeply, celebrating this unexpected bounty, ignoring the fact that the beer was mixed with the grime of the London streets and the debris from the destroyed homes. The scene descended into a drunken chaos that lasted for hours. This macabre celebration led to a second, even more ironic, wave of tragedy. The stories from the time report that a 9th victim died not from drowning or trauma, but from alcohol poisoning several days after the flood, having partaken too freely in the spoils of the disaster. For days after the event, the neighbourhood of St. Giles became a grim tourist attraction. People came from all over the city to gawp at the ruins of the brewery and the destroyed houses and to breathe in the strange atmosphere of the place. And there was, once again, a smell. It was not the great stink of 1858, but it was a powerful public nuisance nonetheless. For weeks, the entire neighbourhood was enveloped in a sickly, sweet, alcoholic stench. The thousands of gallons of beer that had soaked into the ground and collected in the cellars began to slowly ferment and evaporate, releasing a smell of stale, sour beer that hung in the air like a fog, a constant aromatic reminder of the strange tragedy that had occurred. The initial disaster was over, the bizarre aftermath had played out. Now the questions would begin. Who was to blame for this, and what kind of justice could be found for the victims of a flood made of beer? The beer had been cleared from the streets. The dead had been buried in the churchyard of St. Giles. The wreckage was being slowly carted away. Now, in the aftermath of the strange and deadly flood, the city needed answers. A formal coroner's inquest was convened to determine the cause of death for the 8 victims. This was not a criminal trial, but a legal inquiry, and it was here, in a small, crowded room, that the final, most absurd chapter of the story would be written. The brewery owners, the powerful and wealthy Moo family, were present, their faces a mask of somber respectability. The families of the victims were also there, hoping for some acknowledgement of their loss, perhaps some form of compensation for their shattered lives. The testimony was, on the surface, straightforward. The brewery's employees were called to speak. George Crick, the warehouseman, would have recounted seeing the slipped iron hoop. The storehouse clerk, Mr. Park, would have explained his decision not to raise the alarm, stating that such occurrences were not considered unusual or immediately dangerous. The brewery owners would have argued that their vats were built to the highest standards of the day, that they had taken all reasonable precautions, and that the catastrophic failure of such a massive structure was an event that was completely unprecedented and therefore entirely unforeseeable. They presented themselves not as negligent but as victims of a terrible, unpredictable accident. You can imagine the scene, the jury of ordinary London tradesmen listening to the accounts. They were faced with a set of facts almost too bizarre to be believed. Could a business truly be held responsible for one of its vats simply breaking? There was no evidence of malice, no deliberate act of sabotage. It was a story of a slipped iron ring, a dismissed warning, and a catastrophic failure of materials. The law had little to say about such things. There was no precedent for a flood of this kind. It was a legal puzzle wrapped in a tragedy. After hearing the testimony, the coroner and the jury retired to consider their verdict. And when they returned, they delivered a judgment that was, in its own way, as stunning as the flood itself. They ruled that the 8 victims had died casually, accidentally, and by misfortune. In the formal legal language of the day, the London beer flood was officially declared to be an act of God. This was not a metaphor, it was a legal finding. The explosion of a man-made vat of fermenting porter was deemed to be an unpredictable, unavoidable catastrophe of a divine or natural origin, for which no human could be held responsible. It is a moment of supreme, almost comic, irony. An event so clearly rooted in industrial production and potential human error was legally classified alongside earthquakes and lightning strikes. The verdict was a great relief for the owners of the brewery. They were completely exonerated of all responsibility. They would not face any criminal charges, nor would they be required to pay any financial compensation to the families of those who had died. In fact, in a final twist of aristocratic privilege, the Moo Brewery not only avoided penalty, but actually managed to successfully petition Parliament to have their taxes refunded on the thousands of gallons of beer they had lost in the flood. They were, in effect, compensated for their own disaster. Justice had been served, or at least the law had been satisfied. The brewery would rebuild, London would move on, and the story of the 8 people who died in a wave of beer was about to be quietly and conveniently forgotten. London is a city built on layers of forgotten stories. Beneath the modern streets lie Roman walls, medieval crypts, and the buried secrets of plague pits. And among these forgotten tales, the story of the Great London Beer Flood is one of the strangest. In the aftermath of the inquest, the city did what it always does. It moved on. The Moo Brewery, having been cleared of all blame and given a tax rebate for its troubles, rebuilt its vats, though never again quite so large. It continued to operate on the same spot for more than a century, a local landmark whose bizarre and tragic history slowly faded from public memory. The neighbourhood of St. Giles, too, eventually disappeared. It remained a notorious slum for many decades before finally being cleared away in the great urban renewal projects of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The crowded tenements and dark cellars where the victims had lived and died were demolished, replaced by new, wider roads and grander buildings. As the community itself was displaced, so too was its memory of the flood. Why was such a spectacular and deadly event so thoroughly forgotten? Perhaps it is because the victims were poor, Irish immigrants whose lives were considered expendable in the grand calculus of the industrial age. Their tragedy was not seen as a great public disaster, but as a local, contained misfortune. And perhaps the story was just too bizarre. A flood of water is a tragedy, a flood of fire is a catastrophe, but a flood of beer, it sounds like a joke. It is hard to give such an event the somber historical weight it deserves, and so it was relegated to the status of a quirky historical footnote, a piece of trivia rather than a human tragedy. If you were to visit the site today, you would find no plaque, no monument to the 8 people who died there in 1814. The ground where the brewery once stood, where the great vat once exploded, is now occupied by the Dominion Theatre, a grand West End landmark. You can picture the scene. Thousands of people a night, sitting in the velvet darkness watching a show, completely unaware of the strange, deadly history that unfolded on the very spot beneath their feet. The Great Stink and the Great Beer Flood were 2 sides of the same London coin. One was a slow, creeping disaster, born of years of public neglect and solved by public genius. The other was a sudden, violent catastrophe, born of industrial ambition and dismissed by bureaucratic convenience. Both stories, in their own way, reveal the precariousness of life in a great city, the strange relationship between progress and disaster, and the ease with which history can bury its most inconvenient or unbelievable tales. You have journeyed from a river of filth and a flood of beer through 2 of London's strangest memories. Some stories are written in ink. The most important ones are written in scars. Sleep well, and may your own dreams be peaceful. If you're still awake, we'll be waiting for you in the next story, in